Alright, so to me this is the most complicated kind of question that can be asked about a money multiplier. And if you get this, you really have all of the pieces of the puzzle working together in your head. So I left these definitions here because we're going to need them as we go through this problem. And I'm going to try and go as slow as possible and as deliberately as possible through each of the steps so that you guys pick it up. Okay, so assume that banks lend out all of their excess reserves and that currently banks have $5 billion in reserves. So in this formula right here and in this formula right here, we know that R, and I'm going to do this as a before. So this is before the change. Before R is equal to 5. And I'm not going to write out the billions. Okay, so if the Fed lowers the reserve requirement from 20%, so in the before, it was 20%. So I'll write the reserve requirement is equal to 0.2. And then in the after, we're going to have the reserve requirement be 0.1. So we'll have, and I'll change colors one more time, the reserve requirement equal to 0.1. So we want to know how much the money supply increases. So we need to find out what the money supply was here, or just we need to find out what the difference between the two money supplies are. So we need to find out what the money supply before minus the money supply after. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started here and we'll see where we go. So the first thing that I recognize is that we have 2 out of the 3 pieces of this formula, so we can solve for the last one. So we know that 0.2 is equal to 5 over d. Or just simplifying, we know that d is equal to 25, which is just 5 divided by 0.2. So there are $25 billion in demand deposits in this economy because there were $5 billion in reserves at a 20% reserve requirement. So there are going to be the same amount of demand deposits after this change in the reserve requirement. That's not going to change how much money people have in their checking account. So we know here also that D is equal to 25. So the next thing we can find out here is we can find out what R is after. So we have R now, we're just using the same formula over here. We're going to have R over 25 is equal to 0.1. And 25 times 0.1 is 2.5, so this gives us that R is equal to 2.5. So now banks used to have $5 billion in reserves, and after we know that now banks only need 2.5 billion in reserves. 2.5, that B will be for billion in reserves. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to scroll down a little bit. So now we know that banks have $2.5 billion, just 5 minus 2.5. So 5 minus 2.5 is equal to 2.5. So banks have 2.5 billion extra to loan out. And this is the key point of this entire problem. So now banks have 2.5 billion extra in excess reserves. Extra in excess reserves to loan out. To loan out. So the very start of our problem said that we are assuming that banks lend out all of their excess reserves. So now we have this $2.5 billion in excess reserves and they're going to loan them out. So the banks loan 2.5 billion extra just because of this change in the reserve requirement. And now we need to know what the money multiplier is for this economy. So because this problem never mentioned the currency ratio, there's no currency ratio mentioned, we're going to use what's oftenly called the simple money multiplier. And I'm not going to go ahead and do a video about how it's derived, because if you want to see how it's derived, it's right on Wikipedia or any other website. Just Google money multiplier and you'll find the simple one very quickly. So the simple money multiplier, and I'm just going to write this in orange over here, is just 1 over the reserve requirement. So now we just need to multiply our 2.5 billion by 1 over the reserve requirement. So 1 over, what was our reserve requirement again? It was 0.1. So 1 over 0.1 is equal to 10. And so now we have 10 times this $2.5 billion in extra money that's just getting loaned out right now. So the money supply increases by $25 billion. So again, I'm just going to walk through the steps one more time. We use this formula over here, the reserve requirement formula, to figure out what the amount of demand deposits was in the beginning. That gets us D right here. So that's step number 1. Then we know that demand deposits, the amount of money in someone's checking account, is not going to change from before to after. So that gives us the demand deposits after. So then we know with the new reserve requirement, we go ahead and figure out what the amount of required reserves are going to be after the change is made. So we know what demand deposits are and we know what the new reserve requirement is, 0.1 in this case. So that gets us that the new amount of required reserves right here, so this is step 2, this would be step 3, that the new amount of required reserves is $2.5 billion, just the amount of demand deposits times the reserve requirement. And then from there, we take the amount of new excess reserves, which is money that's going to be loaned out, and we multiply it by the money multiplier, which is just 1 over the new reserve requirement. And when you do that, you get your answer, which is in this case that $25 billion of new money is going to be created.